Hello. When I was a student in London, my teacher said to me proudly one day that he had practiced the string crossing etude of Kreutzer every single day for 7 years. And I think the reasons he told me that were twofold. One was to impress on me the importance of legato. Legato, he said, had been replaced by a sort of hyper-emotive portato stroke, almost forcing the legato stroke, which is so pure and expressive and so idiomatic to the violin, into extinction. And the other reason I believe he told me about his excess of practicing that etude of Kreutzer was to enforce on me the idea that when you're practicing a certain movement, it's not enough to practice it for a day or two, or even a week or two. It has to be something that gradually sinks down into the system in such a way that we can recall those actions, those movements, or that concept, whatever it is, in whatever spontaneous situation we find ourselves. So if we're sight reading a Haydn string quartet and there's a difficult string crossing passage, we can subconsciously recall that exercise. It's part of our system and we can negotiate those difficulties with greater ease. So I say this because sometimes students tell me that they've practiced an exercise. Yes, they have done it 2 or 3 days and that's it. And they'll forget it very soon. So I'm urging you, when you're practicing these physical movements that you find on this series of videos, not to let them go after just a few times, but to assimilate them into your system. Today we're going to talk about the rippling effect that you can imagine if you're standing in front of a lake, beautiful calm lake, and up pops a fish and little ripples emanate from both sides. And this rippling effect is what the wrist does when crossing strings over 2 strings. Just a gentle rippling. We can play a nice legato sound from the middle and to the tip. And gradually the wrist is going to cause a slight disturbance in the sound. And that disturbance is going to increase until it's just wide enough to allow those 2 notes to separate. There, now they're separated. And there may be a nanosecond of time between the 2 notes when indeed the 2 strings are sounding together. But that's my starting point, just that gentle rippling of the bow. Now, in order to practice this, I'm going to go back to our old friend Ševčik in his Opus 2, section 3, number 29. And we're going to start with variation number 421, which is actually just what I've been doing. And the way I'm going to do it is starting off with the legato on both strings and gradually separating. And that's number 421. And then I'm going to work backwards only with the open string patterns, all the way back to the beginning of that section, which is variation 398. And I'm playing just the open strings, sometimes E and A, sometimes D and A, sometimes G and D. And when I get to number, the first one, then I'm ready to start adding Ševčik's actual notes, always remembering to keep the body neutral and to make as lyrical and singing a sound as possible. And that applies equally to the shorter of the two notes. So that's to feed that sound. And I can use a metronome. I could even start with the metronome, activating my wrist altogether by playing, let's say, 300 clicks per minute, which will allow me to be absolutely sure that almost as if the wrist was being powered by the metronome itself. That should never sound mechanical, of course, always sound lyrical, but absolutely in tempo. That's really the challenge of these legato exercises. So gradually working from 398, doing maybe 2 or 3 exercises a day, starting fairly rapidly, not too slowly, and then even getting slower because it's harder to control at a slower tempo. So that's going to take me quite a few weeks, because there's no point in practicing 20 exercises in a day. Better to practice 2 or 3 in a really methodical and in-depth manner, rather than just whipping through them as fast as we can. Now, there comes a time in the bow when the wrist movement is no longer possible. When I get quite near the frog, the technique is slightly different. Instead of that wrist movement, which won't work here, won't work, it's a slight seesaw-like movement. So that, just for a few notes. And I'm going to practice that by continuing with variation number 426 and working right through until 458. And I can start that also just focusing on the open strings and making a singing sound. So this number 426 is quite simply this. And 427. Always with this little seesaw, gentle seesaw movement. And by the time I get to 458, I'm actually doing 4 notes to a bow, still with this seesaw movement. Now, if I play 6 or 8 notes, somewhere at some point, I will be able to do the rippling wrist movement. So there's the seesaw movement. Here I can already do the wrist. Now it's seesaw, seesaw and wrist. So it will depend on the size of my wrist and hand and perhaps other factors too, but there will be a certain number of notes that are best achieved at the very frog with that seesaw motion. And when I've done that, well, I can go do exactly the same as I did before, but this time from the frog to the middle, and until I get back, going backwards, until I get back to And once I've done all that, then I can start playing with the whole bow. And that's just about it. We can then bring on the other aspect, which is the coordination with the left hand. Now, I can take just a simple exercise. Again, we've heard that before. That's the Ševčik, Opus 1, the very first exercise. And etc., to just get the feeling of singing both with the fingers. And in some way, the action of the fingers relates to the action of the bow. In other words, the speed of the crossing and the speed of the fingers. And once we've explored that, we can use, there are so many etudes for legato string crossings, but with just 2 strings, I would recommend the 4th etude, the 4th exercise of Schradieck's School of Violin Techniques, where we have beautiful melodies like and we can play those in the most lyrical way, exactly as if we are playing a Haydn string quartet. So there you have it. I hope you enjoy your practicing of legato and assimilating those exercises by constant repetition.